Welcome, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and thank you for joining our CEO series, the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center's premier programming, which draws on the insights of top chief executives shaping the future of energy, climate change, and advanced technologies. And we're broadcasting from our new headquarters in Washington, D.C. at 1400 L Street. I'm delighted to be joined by Josu Jon Imaz, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Repsol, a Spanish multinational energy company. Josu Jon is also a member of our International Advisory Board. He was in the political world for a while, 1/3 of your career, I believe?
1/3, yes, for 13 years, and a lot of time ago.
And one of those jobs was the European Parliament?
Yeah, from 94 to 98, 99, yeah.
And in the Basque region, you were also a regional minister?
Regional Minister of Industry, and I led the mainstream ruling party in the country, the Basque National Party, for 4 years, yeah.
And it's not that politics plays any role in our world, but you've been in both worlds. You've been in industry, and as you are now, and then and in the policy world. So energy and climate policies are top of the agenda as the U.S. and Europe work toward completing the post-election transitions. So today, we're going to learn how global companies like Repsol are navigating this landscape. Repsol is a major player in the North American energy landscape as well, with upstream assets in Pennsylvania, South Texas, Gulf of Mexico, the North Slope of Alaska. The company has also diversified its assets through clean energy investments, renewable, 2 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity installed to date, and the capacity is expected to quadruple by 2030. Before I start, I want to remind our audience that today's conversation is public and on the record, streaming live over YouTube, Facebook, X, and the Atlantic Council website. You can follow over X using the handles Atlantic Council, @Atlantic Council, and @AC Global Energy, as well as the hashtag AC Energy. And Josu Jon, on behalf of the Senior Director of the Global Energy Center, Landon Durrance, and his remarkable team, welcome to Washington.
So thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's an honor for me.
So let's kick this off to dive into your assessment of the new reality of the transatlantic relationship under the new U.S. administration. For those of our viewers who have been on a desert island for the last month without any communication, we had an election here a couple of weeks ago. But I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how you see the biggest opportunities in transatlantic engagement right now, and how the new reality might impact that.
So first of all, let me say that for me, transatlantic is not only a geographical concept. Transatlantic is about values, principles. I mean, we share Europe and the US, democracy, human rights, balance of power, rule of law. So when we are talking about transatlantic, we are talking about all that. That is a very important principle, value, and concept in the world we live in. So from my point of view, it's important to maintain and to strengthen this relationship. Of course, probably now, I assume that could be a bit unbalanced. And probably the new American administration poses the Europeans ourselves under watching the mirror. In some way, we have to increase some efforts we have to make in terms of defense, security, but I mean, protecting, preserving, and strengthening this relationship for me is really important because, I mean, we have a common concern today in the world. We are seeing that China is growing, that China is using probably the energy transition as a geopolitical weapon to increase its influence. So from my point of view, working together under the same rules, cooperating in this scenario is really important.
Thank you for that. The Atlantic Council is really a global Atlantic Council with operations in our programming in Africa, Latin America, Asia. So we embrace the fact that the transatlantic community is a community of values and principles. So thank you for that answer. When you say unbalanced, what do you mean by unbalanced?
Unbalanced means that, I mean, we Europeans, we are taking advantage of the American protection and security. We have the access to American supplies, American technology, American market. And on the other hand, it's true that also the US has the access to the European market. The US has also the support, the logistic and the support of Europeans in its role as a global leadership. But when we compare both sides of the assets we are putting in this relationship, probably the Europeans, we have to increase a bit our own responsibility. We have to assume that we are not children, we are adults. We have to increase our own effort in terms of defense and security, and of course, all that in cooperation with our partners, our friends, that are the Americans.
That makes a lot of sense. When I see the US operating at 2.7, 2.8% growth, and Europe at 0.4, 0.5, Germany at 0% growth, if you multiply that by a number of years, that brings us further apart than right closer together. So I think there's a growth. There's a growth need there as well.
Yeah, and we have to change, as Draghi reports mention, in a radical way, a lot of our policies in Europe to have this growth. Because I mean, when we compare with the situation we had 15 years ago, at that time more or less the US could be at 22% of the global GDP, and Europe more or less the same figure, 22%. And 15 years later, I mean, America has a 27%, and we account for 17%. So, I mean, we have to redress our policies. We have to be more focused on competitiveness, and probably all that is also related to the energy transition. I think that we have to change our energy transition policies with the target of having a stronger and better competitiveness in our industrial sectors.
Well, that's a great segue to talking a little bit more about balancing climate security and competitiveness. So what lessons have you learned, has Repsol learned in the last decade to utilize, to advance, what's been called the energy trilemma? So affordability, security, sustainability. What lessons have we learned about this? Because I think a lot of our viewers might know that Repsol in 2019 was the first, if I'm not mistaken, oil and gas company to set a net zero target.
Yeah, I mean, if we see this discussion from Europe, I think that we have to fulfill the 3 targets of the trilemma. What we did in Europe in some way is focusing fully in decarbonizing the continent, and that is okay, but we forgot the concept of security of supply, and we built dependence on Russia, big mistake. And now we are in some way building a new dependence on China, against a big mistake. We forgot the concept of affordability. I mean, we need cheap energy. And the consequence of forgetting that was that European families, they have had, over the last 2-3 years, difficulties to pay the energy bills. And we have destroyed, over the last 6 years, the 12% of the European industry consuming energy. So you could say, okay, but we have succeeded in terms of decarbonizing. That's not 100% true. What we are doing, probably from our whole effort, a minor part, has been decarbonizing in real terms the economy, but what we did was exporting industries, exporting jobs, and exporting CO2 emissions to other parts of the world. I'm going to put an example. Today, Europe, we could account for an 8% more or less of the total CO2 emissions. Only the Chinese cement and steel sectors combined, they emit an 8% of the total global emissions. So the same figure that the whole Europe. So if we export...
So China, cement and
steel, 2 sectors...
is the same emissions as all of Europe.
The global Europe. Yeah. So if we make impossible in regulatory terms, because the CO2 cost, because the energy cost to produce steel in Europe, and we export this industry to China, and we export this product, I mean, the first consequence in emission terms is that emissions are going to increase in 50%, because these Chinese plants, they are less efficient in energy terms. On top of that, we are destroying our own jobs. But I'm going to say more. If we analyze what has happened in emission terms worldwide over the last 2 years, 22, 23, we could see an increase that is clearly related to power generation using coal to produce this power. What happened? Happened that we Europeans, we forgot our supply of gas. We built our dependence on Russia, and when this Russian gas disappeared from the market in a substantial way, we start importing LNG from everywhere. We multiply by 2, by 3, by 4 the price of LNG, making impossible for the global south to use gas for their own needs. So they had to shift to coal, increasing the CO2 emissions worldwide. So we were really exporting CO2 emissions because of our policy. So we need to rethink the energy transition concept. Decarbonizing is very important, it's crucial, but we have to combine this target with the target of guaranteeing the security of supply and trying to have cheap energy. I mean, you have here in the States a good example of that. You have been over the last 15 years as performant as Europeans. We have been in terms of reducing your emissions, but at the same time, you have increased your energy production.
While reducing the emissions.
Reducing the emissions and having a cheaper energy than in Europe, in your continent.
Fascinating. So let's talk a little bit more about the low carbon energy supplies. Many of the oil and gas majors seem to be pulling back from their investments in low carbon energy. And I wonder how you see this. Is this driven by return on investment, infrastructure, permitting costs? What are the factors at play here? What do you think the trend lines are?
Well, first of all, let me say that we are oil and gas producers, and we are very proud of producing oil and gas.
Yeah, because I think 63% of your production is gas.
Is gas, and more or less 65% of our capex is devoted to hydrocarbons and 35% to low carbon energy. But I mean, we do that because we have to be responsible. The world needs oil and gas, and it's going to need more oil and gas in the future. And restricting the offer is not an option, because we have seen what happened in Europe when we restricted the gas supply. I mean, the world is going to need more energy, is going to shift to coal, and emissions are going to grow. So that is not the solution. So we have to sustain this current system, producing oil and gas, but at the same time, we have to shift to a new system, low carbon energies. And that is a journey. I mean, we can do that in a sudden way in 2-3 years. We are going to need 2-3 decades for this transformation. And in the meantime, we have to guarantee the oil and gas production, of course, and we need clear KPIs, clear targets in terms of reducing the carbon footprint of our operations and our products. And that is what we are doing in Repsol. So for me, going back and getting rid of this effort of decarbonization is not an option. It's not an option. And not only because, let me say, the moral responsibility, because the world needs this kind of new energies. Look at the States, for instance. All this IA is going to need renewable power to feed the huge amount of energy that IA, a data center, and so on, they are going to need. So we need to shift in this transformation. But it's very important to have investors and a financial sector ready to invest not only the green part of the pie, that is okay, not only the brown part of the pie, that is okay, but to invest in this journey. I mean, to work with companies transforming our portfolios.
Yeah, we are expecting in the Trump administration to have an emphasis certainly on natural gas, but on nuclear as well. I think nuclear is going to play a big role.
I fully agree. I think that nuclear is, I mean, one thing that I admire in the US in energy terms is that you are technologically neutral. I mean, you don't have a bias, you don't have an ideology focusing only in some technologies. Sometimes I have seen in the recent past in Europe that some politicians, they are in some way defining what is going to be the energy basket or the energy mix in 10, 15, 20 years. It's a big mistake. I mean, I'm a scientist. We have to rely on science, we have to rely on technology, and we have to use all the technologies that could be useful to reduce the carbon footprint in the world. It's crystal clear that if we were able to increase the gas production in the world, we could reduce in a dramatic way CO2 emissions, because only shifting from coal to produce power to gas, as you did in the States some years ago, could reduce in a dramatic way at 15% of the global CO2 emissions. So we have to take advantage of all technologies, gas, nuclear, energy efficiency, renewable fuels, renewable power.
And so there's talk that the Trump administration would pull out of the Paris Accords, maybe even take another look at the UN process, the COP process. It sounds like what I'm hearing from you is if this doesn't fundamentally change how the energy world will evolve or is evolving.
I mean, my perception, I don't know what is going to happen in the States, and of course I respect a lot the decision of American voters and the new American administration. As I said before, I aim to contribute to this cooperation under the principles of Atlanticism. But when we analyze what has happened in the States over the last 15 years, I mean, Obama administration, Trump administration, Biden administration, reality is that the States, you have been able to produce more and more energy and to do that in a more sustainable way. I mean, America is broad, but when I say it's broad, is the federal administration, there are the states, there are companies, and there is technology behind. And technology is driven, probably, this process. I mean, the unconventional process was not driven by politics. It was driven by technology. Renewable revolution is driven by technology because it's very cheap now to produce renewable power in many places, to have power. And so it seems to me that probably, I mean, this trend is going to go on under the current administration. I don't know what is going to be the new brand, let me say, of the energy policy. I don't know if IRA is going to maintain the brand or they are going to change. But when we are talking about the energy, renewable energy production in the States, we are talking about reindustrializing America, having cheap energy, diversifying energy, giving an opportunity to grow new technologies like data center, IA, and so on. And it seems to me that all that is going to be shared by any political party in the US and any administration. So I'm quite confident about the capacity you are going to have with the past administration and with the new one to go on in this direction.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating to see companies like Microsoft, like Google, like Amazon, having an interest in an energy that 5 years ago it wasn't as high.
It's curious because we are producers of renewable power in the US, and we are seeing a strong appetite from some of the companies you mentioned to sign PPAs in the long term because they need this energy, and they need this energy in the states like, I don't know, Texas, some others, or California or New York, where they are going to have data centers and activities in this field.
So with that, let's transition to talking about your investments in the United States. I'm interested in a general sense how you look at the challenges here, the opportunities, but also talk about what you have invested here in wind, solar, battery storage. You've acquired ConnectGen, 20,000 megawatts. 40% of a U.S. solar and battery company. I think a lot of our viewers don't know how deeply invested you are. You've installed, I think you're planning to install or have installed 40 gigawatts of renewable and energy storage. What's behind all this? What are you looking at? Where are you seeing the opportunities? And how are you thinking about the U.S. market?
We were, first of all, we anticipate this situation because in 2020, we acquired a 40% of American solar developer. So we had an access to a broad and large pipeline of new projects. And as you mentioned, 1 year ago, we acquired ConnectGen with a significant pipeline in wind and in solar resources. So that means that we have, roughly speaking, 40 gigawatts of pipeline, so theoretical areas and projects where we have we could develop this kind of projects. We have to the risk, of course, these projects in terms of environmental permits, in terms of access to the grid, and so on. But this, being prepared for this bet is giving us the opportunity to grow in a significant way and to be part of this revolution of new energy that the world, and particularly the States, are going to need. When we take, I mean, that depends on the sources, of course, but all in all, the power that is going to be consumed under the concept of IT in the world, I mean, I'm putting the same basket, IA, data center, internet, cryptocurrencies. I mean, all in all, we could be talking about a 13% of the total global consumption. That could be more or less something equivalent to the total consumption of the US. So probably in coming, today this figure could be at around 4 or 5%. That means that by 2030, in 7 years, we have to add probably a Germany, 1.5 Germanys in terms of consumption to the world to feed all these sectors. So it's a good opportunity for us to grow.
Adding 1.5 Germanys over what period of time?
Yeah, from now on to by 2030.
That's remarkable.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And as you look at what you've done so far in the U.S., where are you going to try to find more? And what is your strategy here in terms of investments and growth?
I mean, it's true that we are, in the period of 2024, 2027, we are going to invest at around 6 billion euros in the U.S. That for our dimension, I mean, we are not a mayor. For our dimension, is a significant figure. And we are doing that in, let me say, in all the energy segments. We are in the oil sector. We discovered in the North Slope in Alaska some years ago the largest conventional oil discovery in the U.S. over the last 4 decades onshore. We are developing this project, and we are going to start with the first oil by the end of 2025. Probably combined with the Willow project of Conoco, these 2 projects are going to change the Alaska's picture in oil production terms, reversing the decline that this state has had over the last decades. On top of that, we have projects that they were also discovered by Repsol in the Gulf of Mexico, and one of them is going to start producing by June 2025. We are part of the gas production in the US. Probably in hydrocarbon terms, 1/6 of the total global production of Repsol is gas production in the US. So it's a significant figure, mainly in the Marcellus and a part in the Eagle Ford, in Texas. And we have this renewable approach. So we have, let me say, an energy investor in the US. And roughly speaking, at 25–30% of our total investment is developing this country.
But that's really interesting. And could you put that in context if you're looking at opportunities here, opportunities Europe, opportunities in the rest of the world? Where else are you looking outside of the United States? Where else do you see opportunities?
First of all, we are a Spanish company, proud of being Spanish, and our main target is Iberia, Spain and Portugal. We are a leading company in the energy sector in these countries, not only in terms of refining, where we have probably the most performant European refining system, operating from Spain, 1 million barrels a day, roughly speaking. We are a leading company in service stations in Spain, in gas stations in Portugal. We are the second one. We are growing in the retail power business in Spain. We are using the renewable power we produce to grow in this segment. But unfortunately, in Spain, we don't have no oil, no gas. So that means that in terms of exporting and producing, we have to go out our own country. But in a world that is becoming, let me say, more complex day after day, one of our priorities is to try to de-risk our portfolio. I mean, we are investing more and more in OECD countries. For instance, in these, let me say, more stable countries, we are going to devote, roughly speaking, 90% of our total capex over the next 4 years. That is a quite also unique case, because in the oil and gas industry, you know that sometimes you have to go to countries that are not so stable. Right. But in a world that is becoming, let me say, complex, I think that it makes sense. For instance, we were able to divest over the last years from countries like Russia and some others before the crisis of 2022. And in some way, this kind of decision has protected Repsol from having disruptions from the geopolitical side.
It's really interesting. We'll get to geopolitics in a second because I want to talk to you about that. But it is going to be very interesting to our viewers to hear from the CEO of a Spanish multinational, but in Spain, being in Alaska and producing. So that's a wonderful world. But talk about, you paused 3 major green hydrogen projects in Spain.
Yeah.
And I just remember the buzz about green hydrogen. I'm not sure if you remember or know about the movie with Dustin Hoffman and The Graduate, where everyone talked about plastics. A couple of years ago, everyone was talking about hydrogen, green hydrogen. Why have you paused these projects? Where do you see the opportunity still there, and what are some of the obstacles?
I mean, first of all, a disclaimer, I believe in hydrogen. Yeah. Hydrogen is a reality. We are today the main Spanish hydrogen producer and the main consumer. Green hydrogen produced with natural gas. Repsol produces and consumes more or less 62% of the total Spanish consumption year after year. So we know hydrogen. I have the perception that 3 years ago, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in this situation of nerves in Europe after losing the access to Russian gas, I mean, we built a collective dream about green hydrogen. I mean, green hydrogen was going to be the solution for everything. And my point is that that is not real. Green hydrogen is going to be there. Green hydrogen is going to be part of the energy solution. It makes sense, for instance, in sectors like the refining, where we are going to substitute in coming years a main part of our green hydrogen production by green hydrogen, using electrolyzers or biomethane to produce this hydrogen. But it's not a solution that fits all the needs we have. Why? Because it's expensive. I mean, today, taking into account the main cost, that is power cost, to produce this hydrogen, is really difficult to produce hydrogen in a figure below a cost of 4.5 euros a kilo. I mean, 3 times the cost of green hydrogen. In some cases, our own refining case, where we are in some way reducing our CO2 emissions, reducing our cost, we are integrating this hydrogen in the molecule of hydrocarbon. That means that we are producing a renewable fuel, and we have a mandate in terms of policies to be considered as a renewable fuel. It makes sense. If we are thinking about substituting the needs of the European or the American industry could have, steel makers, paper mills, chemical sector, substituting natural gas by green hydrogen, I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's very expensive. These companies, they have to compete. But saying that, we could find niches in some kind of industry where, I mean, the consumer is ready to pay a bit more to substitute this hydrogen. And we have to bet to be prepared, because probably in 5, 10, 15 years, power costs could be different, and we could be talking about different costs of green hydrogen.
And for example, what niche areas do you think that it could take off?
I mean, if we take, for instance, the current, a country like Spain, where we could be in total terms consuming 600,000 tons a year of hydrogen, probably by 2030, 50-60% of this hydrogen is going to be substituted by green hydrogen. But again, we are talking about refining sector and some others. So seeing a strong and quick growth of this new green hydrogen, I think that is not going to be significant in coming 5 years. Probably the decade of 2030, things could be different depending on power production costs.
Thank you for that. So why don't we close with a few questions around the geopolitical situation?
Yes, of course.
Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, and Richard Moore, the head of British intelligence, MI6, wrote a piece for the Financial Times. First of all, it's very unusual for them to write something publicly. But they said that we're facing the biggest threat to the global system that has created so much prosperity and security for us since the end of World War II, since the end of the Cold War, the biggest threat since the end of the Cold War. We've got a war in Europe, a war in the Middle East. You've got tensions with China. You've talked about the rising contest around artificial intelligence for the commanding heights. How do you see the global picture? You talked about de-risking. In this global picture, where do you see opportunities? Where do you see risks? How does a company, I'm talking to more and more CEOs who are spending more and more time talking about geopolitics in the boardroom than they used to.
So, I mean, I remember 7, 8 years ago, I have a talk with an American politician here in Washington. And when I asked him about the main concerns of American foreign policy, I remember the answer was, I mean, in this order, first, China, second, North Korea, third, Russia, fourth, Iran. I remember that answer because if I analyze today, 7 years later, this answer, the new fact is that the 4 problems are interconnected.
Yes. What people are calling the axis of aggressors.
Yeah, so all of them have some kind of a strong connection. And that is a concern in geopolitical terms. For that reason, I mean, from the very beginning of this talk, I said that, I mean, we could have, let me say, the temptation to say, okay, US is strong, could have its own road. I mean, Europe, we could have the temptation of, let me say, working, forgetting this concept of open strategic autonomy, so of building our own supplies, strategic supplies with countries that are reliable and friends. We could have the temptation of building a new dependence on China, as we did with Russia some years ago, mainly Germany and Central European countries. But from my point of view, it will be a big mistake. So for that reason, I think that we have a strong incentive to boost, to promote cooperation, probably, as I said in the beginning, redressing the balance of this cooperation, but between the US and the European Union. We are going to have now a new administration in the US. We are going to have in coming days a new European Commission. Right. I know that it's not the same because in Europe you have a more complex governance. We have the European Union, but we have the member states. We are going to have a new German government in coming months. So I think that we have to try to strengthen this cooperation in terms of trying to redress this situation. And as a CEO of a company, I mean, I try to reduce the risk of my company to this new scenario that could come. So in this sense, when I said before that we are investing 90% of our capex in reliable countries like, I don't know, Spain, Portugal, US, Brazil, areas where we feel comfortable in terms of reducing the risk of the company, is because we are taking into account this complex geopolitical picture that is coming.
So in a world of greater volatility, you're investing in less volatile places.
Yeah, that's crystal clear, and we have, and that it makes sense also for the new kind of energies we are entering in. When you have to invest in renewable fuels and renewable power, rule of law is very important because you are investing at the first moment for coming 15, 20 years. You are taking the decision at the first moment. So you are going to be dependent on the regulation of this country for coming 15, 20 years. So rule of law, stability are more important than for some other sectors. And the great advantage in the case of gas or in the case of renewable power is that the resources are quite spread all around the world. In the case of oil, it was not exactly the same some years ago. Now, fortunately, the US is changing the game, so because it has become the largest oil producer in the world, being a stable and reliable country. So we are in some way shifting in that direction.
Fascinating. Talk to me a little bit along the same lines about sanctions. So obviously they've become we in our Geoeconomic Center of the Atlantic Council track sanctions very closely. We do it under a heading of economic statecraft. Some people feel they're overused, some people feel they're not used effectively enough. My guess, if I were to bet, is that the Trump administration will return to a tougher implementation of sanctions, particularly in the case of Iran. Just surmise. How do the sanctions that are in place right now influence Repsol? How does this influence your business? And do you have any thoughts, reflections on how they could be deployed more effectively to reach geopolitical objectives?
So first of all, I respect the concept that countries that they don't respect human rights or political rights and so on, they could be subject of sanctions. So that's. Secondly, I mean, we are fully compliant with all the sanctions regime from the very beginning. You mentioned Iran. We had in 2011, 2012, I remember. I mean, we acquired at that time Iranian oil. I mean, we were at the first moment we stopped any kind of supply from Iran. So for us, complying with these sanctions, and in the case of being here in America with American sanctions, is a must. So saying that, and that is a personal reflection, I think that probably, and I don't have, of course, all the figures on the table, but it's important sometimes to choose between commercial sanctions and sanctions focused on people, on persons that are related to a regime or breaking human rights and so on, because in many cases, sanctions on a sector, on a product, on the economy, they had a negative impact on the population of the country. Sometimes it's also some kind of let me say, tool for governments to increase their support, building an external foreign enemy. And sometimes some other powers like China, they take advantage of these sanctions to occupy this vacuum. I mean, the Iranian case is a good case. So I don't have, let me say, all the figures on the table to say what has to be done. My point is that all that has to be considered before any policy of sanctions. So the focus of the sanctions is, is the regime. They are the people engaged in breaking human rights, is the population, and an analysis about who is going to occupy this vacuum, and in that case, of course, take the right decision, taking all the elements and the figures. But again, Repsol is fully compliant with any sanctions regime, and we are going to be doing the same thing in the future.
So let me close with a question that is a favorite question of mine to ask people who have important positions like you do as CEO of Repsol. And it's the question of what keeps you up late at night. So what is it that gives you the greatest concern? And then I always like to add a second to this is, what keeps you up at night because you're so excited about the opportunity? So what are you seeing in right now from your position as a great concern, and what are you seeing as a great opportunity?
First of all, let me say that I sleep quite well. That is a great advantage because you have to work the day after. I tend to be very calm, probably because I spent, as you mentioned before, some years in politics, and in Basque politics that was a complex region at that time with, terrorism. All that is over, but I had to experience all that situation. So I tend to relativize problems and to be calm.
And you were in the region at the time when terrorism was more of a danger.
I was a member of government at that time, and of course you could imagine that I had to experience and to suffer this situation for years. So. I think that probably saying that we are following in an accurate way everything related to geopolitics, because probably things change or could change in a dramatic way from one day to the next one, as we saw, for instance, in 2022 in Russia, I have, let me say, I don't see any kind of sudden change related to energy transition. I mean, because that is not a revolution, it's a transition. That means that we are going to have a journey over years, and of course we have to follow what is happening, but we are not going to see, let me say, dramatic changes from one day to the next one. In the case of opportunities, I think I always say transition has to be an opportunity for Repsol. And mainly in the local level. We are a leading company in Spain and Portugal. We have the most reputed brand in the energy sector in these countries. We are in all the value chain of the energy in our own country, so we have to take advantage of any new energy that is appearing. I'm going to put an example. I have a diesel car. I'm proud of having a diesel car, but I also fulfill my tank with renewable diesel in Repsol service stations. So for me, this transformation is not a threat. It's an opportunity of having a broad basket of energies to expand also the number of customers we have, to engage customers that they have the concern of decarbonizing the world. And I think that taking these opportunities has to be in our roadmap.
That's a great place to end. Josu Jon Imaz, President and Chief Executive Officer of Repsol, thank you for this fascinating conversation and one of the first events we've had in our wonderful new headquarters in Washington, D.C.
So thank you for having me, and it's a great pleasure being in this new headquarters. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.